Okay, I just want to think into some ideas to do with originality and creativity, partly prompted by Laura Layla's video on this topic. I will be citing some sources here, but I don't know. I may be abusing them as well as citing them, so I guess that's alright. I think I would want to first off draw a parallel between the way that originality as a term is used and a word like creativity is used. I know they're not exactly coterminous, but they're close enough for our purposes, I think. And the reason why I say this is because creativity has an additional component that originality doesn't, which I'll explain in a second. Most of the language around creativity, and there's lots of different ways it's phrased, but it tends to be, two of the criteria for an entity that's judged creative tends to be, it has to display novelty and value. There's other things as well, some descriptions of it talk about something like intelligence, but novelty and value will do for ours, I think. And I think that the addition of value is useful because originality tends to be kind of analogous with just novelty, and I think creativity also has this additional factor of value in there, which is helpful. I'll just explain what I mean by novelty and value first, with a couple of examples maybe, and then broaden that out to a discussion about creativity on a kind of personal level, and then within a wider domain. So let's have a look at novelty and value. Novelty is easy, isn't it? Novelty is just new, making something that hasn't been made before, saying something that hasn't been said before, putting something out there in the world that's never existed before. Novelty is in a sense kind of easy. There are problems with all of this stuff, but at least in its typical form, novelty is easy. And value is the part of that in which both originality and creativity, I think, become more pointed, because value is always associated somehow with function. Doing the job better than something else means that if an entity does something better than something else, a machine, then it has a higher value. And the same applies to ideas, I think, or to artifacts. And that function might be a practical function, it might be a use function, something that does something, or it might be a more abstract function, like the explanatory power of a scientific theory, for example, or the critical value of a statement. The power with which a statement or an idea can destroy previous ideas. We tend not to think of destruction as creative, but sometimes the most creative ideas are critical ideas, right? And the explanatory power, the power of a piece of criticism, of an original piece of criticism, is its capacity to show the flaws in previous ideas. So a function there's lots of different functions we could talk about. But those, again, function is part of originality / creativity. And you need both for something to be creative. It isn't enough just for something to be novel. So, for example, you can make a teapot out of chocolate, and it might be novel. It might even be a novelty that you would sell in a novelty shop, maybe. But and on a simple level, it's kind of original. Maybe on a really bland level, kind of creative. But why would that? But it's pointless. It has no value. At least in terms of the function of teapots, right? Can't hold hot water, therefore it's functionally barren. So you do need that novelty and value. And as I say, it's something like explanatory power of a scientific theory is another aspect of value. So, for example, in that one, when Einstein came up with his theories, it didn't suddenly turn out that Newton's theories, which Einstein's theories largely replaced, it didn't suddenly render those things as wrong. Newton's ideas weren't wrong. It's just Einstein's theories have more explanatory power. They apply to a wider range of phenomena. Newton's theories are completely correct, or they have explanatory power when they refer to things that are kind of slow-moving, medium-sized objects, that kind of thing. But they fall apart if you try to apply Newton's theories to fast things or small things. Whereas Einstein's theories, you can use those to explain the whole lot. You can talk about medium-sized things using Einsteinian theories, and you can talk about other things. So it has greater explanatory power. It explains a greater variety of phenomena, and that's the value of it. So it's original. It is creative because it's novel. No one had come up with special relativity before or general relativity before Einstein. So of course it's novel, but it also has explanatory power. And there's some kind of weird things about that. I mean, some ideas which have explanatory power can subsequently be proved to be fairly fundamentally flawed, but can still be original and creative at their time, like Lamarckian evolution, for example. Evolution by acquired characteristics. It was novel, reasonably novel at the time, and it had explanatory power. It certainly had more explanatory power than something like special creation, that that God poofed things into being. It had a more explanatory power than that, but it was actually incorrect, and was subsequently superseded by Darwinian evolution. So there's something kind of interesting about that. So creativity / originality as functions which require, or functions which describe entities, describe practices which display novelty and value, I think is where how I would describe that. But these things apply in different domains, and one of the things that Laura Layla pointed to was the distinction between a kind of personal sense of creativity, originality that is part of one's own day-to-day life, and the most kind of earth-shattering versions of creativity which is out there in the public domain, part of the public conversation of ideas. And these things are distinct, but they're not clearly distinct. And the person I would go to to provide a template for this, which I'm going to just put up and then break, is a writer called Margaret Bowden, who did an essay quite a number of years ago now on robotics called "Can a Robot Be Creative and Would We Know?" it's called. And she's talking about whether a robot can be creative. But as part of that, she distinguishes between what she calls P creativity and H creativity, in which the P stands for personal, the H stands for historical. And in a sense, the P creativity she's talking about is the one that Laura Layla in her video and other folks since have talked about, which is, an individual doing something that is new for them, or coming up with an idea that is new for them, or making an object which is new for them, inventing perhaps a piece of technology which is new for them. It's a very stimulating experience. That is P create, personally creative. And she contrasts that with what she calls H creative, or historically creative, which is when something is put into the world which is genuinely new for everyone, like Einstein's theory of relativity, or indeed Newton's laws of motion at the time, or Lamarckian evolution at the time. No one had come up with that before. No one. Not just the person who came up with it, but no one had ever come up with it before. And those things are, of course, remarkably rare. And of course, every example of a historically creative product, Einstein's theory of relativity, is also personally creative for the person involved, right? But of course, not every personal creative thing is historically creative. If you're anything like me, you're doing new stuff all day, constantly folding bits of paper in interesting shapes, or making videos, or making up objects, or doing bits of writing, and none of which I've done before, and you'll be doing the same. You'll be producing things all the time, none of which you've produced before, and yet most of them, of course, have been produced before, millions of times by other folk. In fact, most of these videos that I make, I've produced before, because most of my videos are the same ideas trotted out again and again. And they're not new ideas, they exist in the world. Even if I don't know they exist, even if I don't know the fact that most of these ideas are about, I know that they're about. I don't have any illusions that the things I'm coming up with are genuinely new introductions to the world. Some of it, sometimes I know that they're already extant out there, sometimes I don't, but I can be pretty sure that they will be. So that's the distinction between P creativity, personal creativity one feels, and H, creativity, historically creative, a genuinely new contribution to the sum total of human knowledge. If you imagine human knowledge like a cairn of stones, occasionally someone will put a little stone on the top. Something that has never been said before, but which displays novelty and, crucially, value. It isn't always as simple as that, though, is it? Because, as I mentioned before, talking about scientific theories of Einstein or Lamarck, or Newton and Lamarck particularly, sometimes history doesn't treat ideas well, doesn't regard ideas as creative, even in the sciences, or subsequently reveals what appear to be creative and original ideas as actually redundant failures, as having little value. So historically creative, historically original ideas, whilst they might be original in the sense of no one has thought of this before, sometimes they don't stand the test of time. So you might even say that the power, the strength, the value of a historical idea isn't just that it's the first time anybody's said this remarkably valuable thing, but it's something that stays valuable, stays at the cutting edge, stays on the top of that cairn of stones for a long, long, long time. Ideally, infinitely. And I guess the only example of that I can think of is something like mathematical theorems. When a mathematical theorem is proven, it's a huge deal because they're almost never disproven, but it's permanent. It's you know, when I think it was Andrew Wiles proved Fermat's last theorem, Fermat's third theorem. Is it third? Anyway, his last one. A few years ago. That was a massive deal because this is a theorem, a proposal that Fermat had come up with a couple of hundred years ago, which has been sitting there unproven. Andrew Wiles proved it, and that's it. It'll stay proven for eternity, or as long as there is mathematics, as long as there is the concept of maths. So it's a historically creative, historically original piece of ideation by Andrew Wiles. It just stays around in a way that even really robust scientific theories don't. At some point in the future, someone will come up with a better explanation than Einstein, and Einstein will just fall back a wee bit. It'll still be powerful, but it won't be as creative and original as the thing which supersedes it. So you can see, so even historically creative ideas are not a single undivided entity. Some are more historically significant and robust than others. And I guess at the opposite end of that, of historically creative, historically original, you would put something like fashion. I don't know, maybe this is not a very good example. But if you're in the fashion world, you put your collection at the Milan show, and there it is. No one in the history of human existence has ever designed a frock exactly like that one before. It's novel, it's valuable in some kind of aesthetic sense, and that's open for discussion, and it'll last exactly 1 year, and then it'll be superseded by somebody else or the next collection that takes a little walk along the catwalk. So again, as I say, historical creativity, a recognition of something as historically original or creative. Yes, it has to have that novelty in terms of it's the first appearance on the horizon of human knowledge, but duration is also significant as well. So personally creative and historically creative. Let me just go to personally creative for a bit. I'm sorry this video was so long. It's an interesting topic. The thing about personally creative is fascinating. Because if you're anything like me, occasionally you'll get ideas and you think, fucking hell, it's brilliant. I've had this fantastic, brilliant idea. And I remember as a child coming up with this all the bloody time. You know, because I was always drawing things as I was a kid, like inventing rockets and weapons and machines to do various things. I was always doing this kind of stuff. And every time I'd do one, I was like, fucking hell, this is brilliant. Look, I've invented this rocket and it does this. And I'd take it to my mum or to my brother. And they'd be very kind, but eventually they'd have to say, well, look, you know, these things already exist, you know. And I'd get, oh, you know, someone's done it before. And then I'd go and sketch another one. Look at this. And no, it's done it before. So, you know, after a while, you kind of get used to that. And it still continues. I still get that fantastic buzz of, oh, God, I've solved the problems of the fucking universe with this idea. Or I've just solved a small problem in this minor area of philosophy with this idea. And then, of course, you do a bit of reading about it and you think, oh, actually, no, that was solved back 1,000 years ago. And that can be a little bit distressing, you know, because we do like to think of ourselves original thinkers, and we like to believe the evidence of our senses in that sense of fulfillment, the sense of illumination that you get when you come up with an original, what feels to you like an original idea, and what for you is an original idea. You know, that sense of breakthrough that you get is very compelling, isn't it, and seductive. And you want to tell people, and you want it to be original to the whole world, and it isn't. Almost all the time, it isn't. 99.999% of the time, it isn't. And that's fine. I guess it's just something you have to get used to, isn't it? I'm completely used to it now. I know most of the ideas that I come up with. Actually, I was saying now, every single idea that I come up with now is out there in the world somewhere. I just might not know it. So you do have to kind of get used to that, and just recognise that feeling of illumination for what it is. That's your consciousness going into overdrive and rewarding you for thinking. Really, that's a good thing. That's not to be sneezed at. But it isn't necessarily, well, it almost never is, a significant contribution to human wisdom. Although some people clearly think it is. I hate to keep referring to the philosophy of mind community here on Google+. But if you go there, you know, clearly some people seem to think that they, and I'm not saying they're insincere, but seem to sincerely believe that the kind of aphorisms that they're coming up with are significant contributions, but they're more contributions to their own realizations and their own education, I think, and their own working out of ideas, which is a good thing, but almost never has historical significance in my experience. Is there anything else to be said about that? I think that's probably it, actually. Creativity and originality. Yeah, I think a bit of humility is good in that, in the sense of not confusing our personal sense of fulfillment, our personal sense of illumination, not confusing that sense with any estimation of what value it might have to the wider world, a recognition of the debt that we all hold to the wider world, to the history which is coming through us, that we've picked up by osmotic pressure almost, and which is allowing us to have these thoughts. I think individual creativity and individual originality is mythologized in ways which are way beyond its capacity almost all the time. Which isn't to say we're not interesting and important special snowflakes, of course we are, but not every idea we have is original. In fact, almost none of them are. So yeah. Last thing, I might as well make this really long. I look up 17.5 minutes, the longest video I've made in ages. I suppose what I would want to think about, which I have thought about to a certain extent, and I'm just going back here to Margaret Boden's distinction between the personally creative and the historically creative, the kind of creative and original thinking that we have, which is just us thinking it and having that feeling, and the distanced historical, maybe the ideal one, the Andrew Wiles of this world, who make a contribution to the historically sum total of human knowledge, which is permanent, truly in every sense a creative and original act. That distinction, I think, is too categorical. You know, I would want to think about the middle ground, and the middle ground for me is all about context. And this is really important. There's something like the arts, but also the social sciences, because we tend to hold these paradigms and then use those as if they were categorically distinct entities, but they're not really. In between those, there's all these other kinds of ways of being creative and original and knowing things and believing things and working with things, which are not really to do with an aspiration towards ultimate historical significance, nor about a collapse into the purely subjective sense of, ooh, I've never thought that before. But they're to do with context. And because most of the time, our original thinking is original because it's taking place within original places, or because it's context dependent, because it's an absolutely appropriate and original and creative contribution to that specific area of concern, but has no wider application, or might be very temporary. You know, the aspiration towards historically permanent truths is fine, but that applies to almost nothing. Doesn't apply to the hardest of sciences, so it's not going to apply to most of what we do. And So a recognition of the highly contingent, highly temporary nature of most of our originality and our creativity is more interesting for me, which is one of the reasons why I like the metaphor of the conversation. Conversations are temporary, contingent, highly localized pieces of interaction within which we are constantly making little original contributions. Not earth-shattering, not permanent, but just adding to the little cairn that we're building, you and I, together, by just talking to each other in that space. Anyway, that's 20 minutes. Sorry. Thank you for your patience if you've stayed this long. Bye.